However, looking in on the kingdom from the outside, we must immediately take up arms against some of our left-wing Labour MPs, who clearly have no real experience or understanding of Saudi Arabia as a country.
Yeah. Bravo.
They go for headline-grabbing items such as women's rights, execution, and the like. Having lived in the kingdom and having conformed to their culture, I know that there are certain benefits in the perceived restrictions, i.e. women are safer here than they are in the UK. However, while I do not deny that the freedoms the UK may be, and probably are attractive to many men and women in Saudi Arabia, this goes against most of the cultural norms, and any changes which take place in the kingdom must be seamless. The alternative is chaos. Is Saudi Arabia moving towards Western ideals? The answer is an emphatic yes. There are now more Saudi business women reaching important posts in management than ever before, and education and training is paramount. But all this must be seen in the context of Saudi Arabia's cultural position as a custodian of the two holy places. Imagine the result if absolute freedom of human rights and civil liberties were allowed in the kingdom. Alcohol was freely available, women were allowed to dress provocatively, and scant attention was paid to the country's culture. The result would be total mayhem. At the very best, you would get an Islamic revolution along the lines of Iran, and at the worst, Saudi Arabia would be turned back to the Dark Ages along the lines of the Taliban. Regarding the Saudis' fight against terrorism, I'm not sure why this has been included. Yes, there have been terrorist attacks in the kingdom, as there are elsewhere in the world, and yes, there have been Saudis involved in terrorism, but so have sadly British citizens been involved in terrorism here in the UK. The good news is that the incidents in Saudi Arabia have been very efficiently dealt with, and many of the perpetrators brought to justice. To my knowledge, our two kingdoms work closely together to combat terrorism, and we should all be thankful for that. Saudi Arabia must be allowed to move forward at its own pace. Think how long it has taken for us in the UK to get to the point that we are. I can still remember the days when my grandmother would not go outside the house unless she was wearing a headscarf or a hat. So, ladies and gentlemen, having been involved with Saudi Arabia for over 35 years, I would like to wind up by saying that it is a huge mistake for politicians, whether they are of British stock or not, to try and impose Western standards of culture on an Eastern country. We tried to do this in the past with the Shah of Iran, and look where that has got us.
Michael, thank you very much, and I'm not one of those left-wing MPs, but I'm a Labour peer, and I could ask you lots of questions, but we'll leave that for later on, because I know that Daniel Kauzensky, MP, who's a Conservative Member of Parliament, but also Chairman of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Saudi Arabia and Libya, wanted to say something. I know that he was eager to say during both of the other the speeches. Now he has got the opportunity for the next 10 minutes. The floor is his.
Thank you very much, Lord Ahmed. I'd like to say that I greatly enjoyed Michael's speech. I think I found a kindred spirit there. Finally, we have somebody who's talking sense about Saudi Arabia, because I've been so frustrated over the 4.5 years being a Member of Parliament about the extraordinary ignorance about Saudi Arabia amongst my fellow parliamentarians and throughout the United Kingdom as a whole. And it's very good to listen to somebody like Michael, who has had experience of Saudi Arabia, putting the other side of the coin. There are, of course, countries around the world where there are bad human rights abuses, but Saudi Arabia is not one of them. One country that springs to mind that where I have visited is Sudan, and I have actually met with President Omar al-Bashir and walked around the refugee camps in Darfur and was absolutely appalled at the human rights abuses that go on in that country. But Saudi Arabia is a very different matter, and I too am very worried that we are spending time, with all due respect, that we are spending time deliberating Saudi Arabia when there are so many other countries with real human rights abuses that this chamber and conferences like this should be addressing. Countries like Sudan, Burma and China, amongst others. And before we preach at the Saudi Arabians, let us for a moment think about the human rights abuses in Europe for one moment, before we start to lecture others around the world. Just this week, we have had a most extraordinary situation in Switzerland, where the Swiss people have voted to ban minarets. Now, I find that absolutely outrageous. What sort of abuse of human rights is that? Think about all the abuses that happened in Bosnia against ethnic Muslims in that country. We are by no means perfect here in Europe. And I think before we start criticizing Saudi Arabia and other countries, we should really start to get our own act in order. The liberal elite media of this country like to portray Saudi Arabia as extremely conservative and hard-line. But of course that argument is far too simplistic. I remember the days of communism, and my own family came from Poland, which was a communist country. Of course there were communists, and some of those communists were hardliners, but there were also many reformers, people who understood that Poland had to change, that society had to change. And what did people like Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan do? They didn't just ignore these people and these countries. They realized that the only way to get change in communism was to engage with the reformers in those communist regimes. And so ultimately, somebody like President Gorbachev sprang up and managed to get rid of communism. So of course, as in Saudi Arabia, like in any country, there are conservative people who want the status quo, and there are people who want to reform the society, and particularly amongst the young. And these are the people that as parliamentarians we have to engage in. Now, as chairman of the all-party group for Saudi Arabia, I take members of parliament to the kingdom, and I'm always bowled over by the warmth of the people in the streets of Riyadh, the genuine, the sort of atmosphere that there is in Riyadh, the friendliness of the people, how they approach you, how open the society is. I'm giving you my own perspective as a British MP of how I find the situation on the streets of Riyadh. The interaction with the Shura Council, the great respect that I have for many members of the Shura Council who come from a wide range of Saudi society. And I'll tell you one thing, I haven't taken a single member of parliament out to Saudi Arabia yet who hasn't come back amazed, with their eyes opened, and who has said to me, actually, you know, we didn't realize it was like this. We just believed the liberal elite newspapers. What an incredible country.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And last time I took, just very recently, Ming Campbell, the former leader of the Liberal Democrats, whose party has been critical of Saudi Arabia in the past. And he came away from that trip praising Saudi Arabia and was amazed. And he said that he couldn't recognize Saudi Arabia from the Saudi Arabia that he visited in 1983, 1984. Such is the change, a quick pace of change in the kingdom. I've had the great honour of meeting with King Abdullah, and I know that he is a great friend of the United Kingdom. And as custodian of the two holy mosques, he obviously has a special, unique responsibility. And so although he wants to reform quicker, I know that King Abdullah would like to reform Saudi quicker. Being the custodian of the two holy mosques means that the weight of that extraordinary responsibility means that he has to be sometimes a little more cautious than he would like. We must remember our own Vatican, and I'm speaking as a Catholic here. I'm very frustrated with the Vatican City, with some of the secrecy of the Vatican City, some of the extraordinary statements coming out of the Vatican City. But nevertheless, as a Catholic, I have to appreciate that there are traditions there in the Vatican City. Now, I'm going to wind up, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to finish off by talking about counter-terrorism. I have met with many ministers in Saudi Arabia and with ministers here in the United Kingdom. And the British ministers and the Saudi ministers have told me